Hi, and welcome to Drafting Compliance. I'm Kayne, he's Tom, and we talked about Hyperproof's FedRAMP journey last time. Today, we're talking with special guest Mathew Feldman, Director of FedRAMP Compliance at Celebrite. But before we get to that, we have some beers. What are we drinking today, Mathew?
Today we're going to try a beautiful Pilsner Urquell from the Czech Republic. It is a delicious light beer, especially because we're coming into the summertime right now. It's crisp, light, and easy to drink.
I agree
Crisp,
with
light,
that.
easy to drink, and also comes in a very big can. This is another one of these that
Oh, you got the can.
Yeah, I got the bottles.
Yeah, I got the
This is
bottle.
all that I could have. And it comes in a 4-pack, so if anybody wants to get a beer, just
Well,
DM me on LinkedIn, and I'm sure I can drop
could
this off at your house.
this could end up being your favorite beer ever, Kane. So before you say that, we should taste it.
Better than the last one, Tom, that you didn't like?
Yeah, probably much better. I'm gonna pop the top on this so we can get going. You know, this beer has a really interesting story, and I'll share it real quick. This brewery is really old. I think 1840 or so is when they served their first beer. And it
1842.
1842. All right, you've got
it's
it
on
nailed.
the bottle.
Oh, okay.
Wasn't there a song about that and somebody who went sailing in an ocean?
Maybe. This brewery was started because the local population revolted against the beer that was served in that town. And they actually pulled all the barrels out and dumped them in the street and demanded that there be better beer. So
I've heard that beer is revolting, Tom. That's what I'm taking away from this story.
So they created this brewery. The government actually sponsored somebody to go study brewing techniques and build a brewery right on the river. And I think it's the Elba River, if I'm not mistaken.
Huh.
So this is a beer that is founded in revolt. So I think that's pretty cool.
Okay,
Really clear beer.
Has a really interesting picture on. I'm not sure if it's coming through on the camera there, but at the bottom of the can, I don't know if that's like a stamp of approval from a government or if it's supposed to be a building. Hard to say. Neat looking can though. It says the original Pilsner. So Tom, we've done a Pilsner on the show before, haven't we?
Yeah, we've had Pivo, which is a Pilsner.
I don't remember the name of it, but I think at least I've had this style. All right,
yeah.
Well, I'm gonna try not to get my nose in the foam.
I've already tasted it. I'm way ahead of you.
Right,
Tastes amazing, but it smells.
It smells like almost nothing.
It's very
maybe
grainy.
Banana.
Yeah, banana, grainy. I don't know. What are you smelling?
A bit of a
Matthew?
sour note.
Are you
in there
just
too.
Are you just going in for the drink?
I'm just going for the drink. No, it's a delicious tasting beer, right? Like, so after a hot summer day of doing work outside or sweating a lot, it's a really refreshing, beer for that.
All right, well, I'm gonna have a go at it and see what it's like.
Have you never had it before?
I've had it many times. Kane definitely has never had this beer.
Oh boy, it's gonna be one of those.
It's
not.
one of those.
Oh,
Not your favorite is what I'm gathering from there. But,
it is better than we have subjected ourselves to voluntarily on this show. I get notes of kind of grass off this, and just to clarify, because I'm in Washington State, I mean grass clippings. So if you wanted to if you'd been mowing your lawn on a hot summer day and you wanted to eat the mulch, this has kind of got that flavor profile to me, though not quite as green, more of burned grass flavor. With
it's not like juniper and sage, right? Like what you would get out of a gin. But if you wanted, we could change the format of your show here and go with a bourbon, a whiskey, or scotch.
We've talked about.
I just did that yesterday. Actually, I just did that. I'm not sure if it's going to be up on YouTube anytime soon, but we did an American-style whiskey and bourbon show. Not
Nice.
Drafting Compliance, though.
should have-
I tell you, going to work after that for the rest of the afternoon, because we finished off with Old Fashions, that meant
Sure.
for a spicy day in the office.
Yep. Well, so you should add bacon to that. So do a bacon
nice.
bourbon
I love
kind
that
of scenario where you get a specialty bacon and a nice good bourbon to go with it. And if you want bourbon, options, I have a lot.
Fantastic. Well, I love the idea of bacon. That's what we should do on the show, Tom, at some point. We should have brunch.
I'm game.
Is there a good brunch beer, Tom, in the world?
I think any beer is a good brunch beer. So you won't find me turning many down.
cinnamon sticky bun ale, my
Okay,
friend.
you got me there. Not a great one for any time of day.
No, 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 no. Okay, cool. Well, so let's move past the beers for a moment here. And Matthew, we had you on because we were hoping you could help elaborate on. I want to take a different angle with this show today. I want us to talk like we were beforehand about the adversarial perspective, the threat actor, the nation state perspective. So, talk us through the primary objectives that adversaries are pursuing when they're targeting systems that are governed by FedRAMP controls, and how FedRAMP's framework and requirements actually addresses those threats.
Well, that's a big can of worms that you just opened up there, right? Because like we could talk hours about that topic that you just mentioned, right?
So we got 40 minutes, so let's go.
So this is going to be dependent on each system, right? Like each system has its own special sauce. They have their own PII. They have their own, supply chain risks that are coming in. You can't just put why an ATP is going to be coming at a specific system or an adversary is going to come at a specific system. It's going to be based on, if you're Lockheed Martin, right, your defense contracting, and you have the special sauce of how you build your missiles, what the missiles have in them, how the planes are being built, what are they delivering, right? So each system would need some kind of a business impact analysis, a security threat analysis to understand what each system has and what each adversary would be looking for. And then you would need to protect that with defense in depth and mitigating controls, that are protecting the sensitive information of each of those different environments. So there's not a one shoe fits all kind of scenario here. It's going to be every system. It has different target reasoning for why an adversary would be coming at you.
Yeah, and two notes thing. First of all, so you said an acronym there, just for our viewers at home. APT is Advanced Persistent Threat, or in the case of some groups, like Lapsus, that's Advanced Persistent Teenager. But Tom, we did something like this when we were architecting FedRAMP for Hyperproof, right?
Well, we certainly look at what are persistent threats that we need to worry about. But that's sort of the beauty of FedRAMP in my mind, right? Is FedRAMP is very comprehensive. It's meant to say, hey, we don't always know where the threat is going, so we need to be diligent and really comprehensive in our security posture. And certainly that's what the government said is hey, we want to consume more innovative tools from the cloud community, but we've got to safeguard what is our special sauce as a government, and of course that bleeds over to those who provide services to the government as well. So I look at FedRAMP as saying, hey, we don't know exactly what the threats are, but we know there's threats, so let's be comprehensive in our approach.
Yeah, you have to identify, right? You need to identify what those threats are going to be, right? So that you have a better risk posture about what is happening inside your environment so that you know what the risks are. If you don't know what they are, how do you defend them?
That's right. That's really what it comes the layers on top. Yep, I agree with that.
I think there's more to it than identification. Like it's not necessary to just identify your threats. A lot of our prior shows that we've done have been around the assessment boundary and which systems are in scope and that asset identification. And Mathew, tell us a little bit about how FedRAMP really guides organizations in identifying the most valuable assets. I think you called them the crown jewels, the aerospace plans, Lockheed Martin, for example. How do we identify those most valuable assets that adversaries could be interested in, and what strategies are in FedRAMP for actually protecting those assets?
So FedRAMP doesn't really get into what your adversaries are going to be. That's your job to figure that out as the cloud service provider, to understand what your system is and what you need to put in place in order to protect your reputation, your files, your infrastructure, your special sauce, right? Like whatever those things might be. So business impact analysis, a threat landscape, threat modeling, all kind of take into account of what are we trying to protect and why, right? So in the PCI world, it's credit card data, right? Where is that data being stored? Who has access to it? Is somebody going to exfiltrate this data out? Do I have alerting systems that are telling me that nefarious things are happening? Who are my insider threats, right? Like, so you you have to worry about each employee that's in your environment and who has access to those things. So FedRAMP will put in, controls that will validate who has access, what permissions they have, are they still appropriate, and this goes right into what's called continuous monitoring. That once you have authorization, you then need to run reports, have approvals, go through change management. The list goes on for what FedRAMP does in this space, but that continuous monitoring piece is really validating the access, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the environment in a 30-day timeline. And there's going to be different criteria: annual, semi-annual, quarterly, monthly, weekly, continuous monitoring pieces that need to be happening. This goes right into logs as well, where we are looking at what each of the systems are doing, what the administrators are doing, what commands that they're running, was that authorized to be run, and validating all of these things through human eyes and through artificial intelligence, through things like SOARs and SIM tools that kind of give us the story of what is happening in the environment and why. And we need that human element to be looking at those, because AI is not always going to find every little thing that you care about in that regard. It only knows what you tell it. And the human needs to go look at it so that it can validate that these things are true, right? So I'll give you an example. A brute force attack, right, is 1,000 hits to a username and password in 30 seconds, right? That's easy for the SIM tool to recognize that this thing is happening. But if I do what I would like to refer to as a slow and low type attack, where I'm going to hit your user account because I know you're using Active Directory. I know that if I do 3 attempts in 15 minutes, it's going to lock the account. So now I'm going to take my adversary and I'm going to say, I'm going to attack this account every 15 minutes with a new password, which is going to then fall under the radar of the SIM tool. But a human is going to be able to see that pattern, right? And be able to go, hey, why am I continuing to see this username have a bad password attempt every 20 minutes, right? And that's a slow and low attack, right? The adversary is really taking their time. They have nothing but time and patience to work through these processes to try and gain access and a foothold into your environment, right? Now, multi-factor authentication, like hardware tokens and OTPs, tokens will help protect that environment for sure, but it's not infallible, right? Now, a hardware token is way better than an OPT or an SMS, type thing. So I would recommend hardware tokens for these things. Use a YubiKey 5. FedRAMP just came out with some new requirements that are anti-phish resistant multi-factor authenticators that are going through that, because we've seen those types of attacks happen as well, where people gain access to SMS messages and then all of a sudden they gain access to your environment. I'm not trying to rabbit hole here.
We go down rabbit holes quite often, Matthew. That's okay.
Yeah.
That's what the beer is there for.
To rabbit hole more? Gotcha.
Yeah, and we will make sure, because I know Tom and I have done episodes on continuous monitoring and logging. We'll make sure that those are in the show notes. But Tom, anything else you have for strategies to add on to what Matthew's provided?
No, I mean, he makes a great point, right? You've got to take the time to understand in your business and your business model, what are the threats that you're going to face? And you've got to be willing to model those threats out against the mitigating steps you have in place and see where your gaps are. And certainly, you have to be agile enough to say, are our remediations that we've had in place for, a year, 2 years, 3 years, still suitable given the changes in that threat landscape? And you talked about some really good ones there, Matthew. Certainly, we've seen authentication protocols change, and we've seen MFA strategies evolve to the point where most people should be looking at those again.
Yeah, I think that's very, very valid.
That's where zero trust really comes into play here, right? Like, you want to build a secure environment, you build it with zero trust, model going forward. Everything is PKI, everything is trust but verify. Everything is utilizing a certificate to authenticate that is controlled by you, right? The organization, and then you can revoke those certificates and then put in new ones if something happens to the cert itself. But everything has a cert, which is a high overhead. In it, and it costs a lot to implement, and it's not a requirement today. But the U.S. government is pushing for all U.S. government infrastructure to be zero trust. I can't remember the date off the top of my head, but that's going to push down into FedRAMP over time, right? So if you're building a FedRAMP environment today, you really want to start thinking about utilizing zero trust into that model so that you're already ahead of the game when the US government comes later in like FedRAMP revision 6 and says zero trust is mandatory now. Right now, companies are going to start to incur a huge cost to revamp their product in order to meet that zero trust compliance that's moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's something to, especially just thinking on like processors that are in use, because having encryption on everything assumes that you have a way of accelerating that encryption, but without compromising the secure enclave that the key material tends to be contained in. But again, that's probably a whole other rabbit hole that we could spend time in that I don't necessarily want to spend time in. Because Matthew, I know you've also been doing this for a while, and talking about threat management, I was thinking about risk management as well. And can you tell us a little bit about your experience of how because I know FedRAMP's got risk management principles embedded in it, how that influences the way that organizations are perceiving and then responding to potential threats?
Yeah, I mean, FedRAMP doesn't really clarify, what the potential threats are going to be. Again, that's really up to the cloud service providers to really identify what those are. But they do go through incident response, right? And you have an incident response plan on how, and you're supposed to depict all the different types of incidents that could be happening. And that includes like natural disasters and, my contingency planning, for if things go sideways, right? Like I get a DDoS attack going on, which you already should have mitigation for, but let's just say that you didn't, and now all of a sudden your website's not functioning at all, and you're in a DDoS, you have an incident that just took place, and you have a plan, a run book of what is supposed to be done, so that nobody has to think about what are they supposed to do when something takes place. They go to the book and they go, oh, step 1. Step 2, step 3, and then it goes down this list of what is supposed to be done for each type of incident that could be taking place. Now that's a really large document, right? There's a ton of things that could take place, and then you need to go through testing of those incident response plans, right? You need to do that annually by FedRAMP requirements, but I highly recommend that you do it more often, right? Tabletop exercises, functional tests, that need to be done in the system to see where the shortcomings are going to be if an incident takes place and somebody doesn't do what they're supposed to. You could end up in a much bigger deal, kind of moving down the road. If you have data exfiltration happening, or you have ransomware that just hits your environment, which is a huge button right now, how do you mitigate ransomware in your environment? There's a lot of ways to do it. Right? You can make it so that if you do get hit with ransomware, you shut things down, you quarantine that environment. You then have backups that you bring back into the environment, through your SLAs that you have created with, the systems and your customers that are required for you to have whatever your uptime is, or whatever that data is going to be. And that's all done through like business impact analysis again, right? Like I'm going to keep falling back probably to business impact analysis on the importance of what that is. Yep. and how you need to leverage that in order to understand your business, right? So
Tom, let's get you in here on this, Tom, because I know BIAs are something that we've talked about before as well. Anything to respond to on terms of Matthew's perspective on that?
Well, I'll just say this. I think a lot of security professionals sort of minimize the importance of the BIAs. And the reality is that is the bridge between you and the business. It is the language that you can create that helps your business understand what the risk is. And so not only is it a required document, for different compliance platforms, but it should be a required document for you to help you formulate how you want to communicate with your business. But too many times, information security is moving forward and saying this is what we see as risk. They're not getting the impact from the business side correct. So I can give examples of that, right? I've seen folks that have authentication wrapped up in a single cloud provider, and they don't test what happens if that single cloud provider goes away through nefarious or business attacks. So the importance of that is you underline where you see your risks are, but you also communicate and find out where the business sees some of those risks as well. They both need to be accounted for. I think that's really smart.
Yeah, and it's a collaboration really with the other business leaders. I think there's been this magical perception that we as CISOs can intuitively understand what the impact of a given event or incident will be. And I if I don't run the sales system, if I don't have staff that work on the sales system, and yet I wet finger in the wind say, well, it's going to be about this $1 million, right? I should be laughed out of a boardroom if I'm a CISO that does that. And yet there's still this perception that CISOs can conduct a business impact analysis themselves. And I'd say right now, you can't. You have. It's the reason it starts with the word business is you're supposed to be friends with them, right? So do work towards that.
Each department needs to have a stake in that, right? Because each department is going to have their own risk appetite that is there, right? So you mentioned the sales department. If they can't take a credit card and sell a product, that's a business requirement, and that's a huge impact to the organization. That where you could be losing millions of dollars an hour in that regard if I can't take or process credit cards, or somebody can't get to my website, right? If the data center goes down, what does that impact, right? And that may not impact sales as much. That may impact other aspects of the business that are there, right? So each business unit needs to have a seat at the table of the business impact analysis to identify what risks and what impacts are for their part of the organization to move forward, so that you can have a complete risk register of what is going on for the business, so that you know what you need to protect and what you don't. Where do I need to put my money, right? What tools do I need to protect those environments, right? So you don't want to, there's a balance between security and usability. And it's a very fine line that you kind of have to walk, right? Like, as a cybersecurity professional, I want to secure the world, right? Like that's just my focus. That's what I want to do. But that's not a business function that works for organizations to continue to do business, because my security may hinder the livelihood of the business in the long run, right? So I kind of have to toe that line between that balance, that usability versus security. All of the time, right? I have to give a little to get a little. If I make your password 64 characters at a minimum, I'm going to have an uproar, from every user in the organization going, this is just absolutely ridiculous. And then I could change their password every 5 days, right? Like it's just not, it's not functional, to do that. So I have to have contingencies about what am I doing and how am I doing it, and how does that impact the business in general.
Absolutely. And I'll say this, if you're enjoying this conversation today on YouTube, ring the bell to get notifications about my quest to find literally any beer that's drinkable, or subscribe to this podcast in your podcast app of choice to make this part of your monthly routine. So we've been talking about risks. We've been talking about business impact analysis. I want to shift the conversation a little bit here, Mathew, and let's talk a little bit about how FedRAMP's collaborative approach, just riffing off of our last question about working with the business, let's talk about FedRAMP's collaborative approach between government and private sector is really influencing the development and the implementation of these controls against threat actors.
Well, so the government's really slow at doing things, right? So
Shocks no one.
they're behind the 8 ball all the time for what is actually a risk out there. This is where compliance and security don't really jive, right? Mm-hmm. Compliance is a check mark that says, hey, I meet the minimum security requirements in order to have this compliance in place. We need, as a group of businesses and professionals to go beyond what the compliance states, right? And that's where we talked a little bit about zero trust just a minute ago, right? It's not implemented today. It's not a requirement by FedRAMP. It's not a requirement by any framework, at this particular moment. But it's something that we as an organization need to look at to understand, how do I mitigate risks that FedRAMP is not telling me exist or doesn't care about today? And we saw that from revision 4 to revision 5 with supply chain, coming in. That's the SR control family that has been added to the NIST 853 FedRAMP framework that's coming in, that says, how do I get information from other organizations that connect into my boundary, right? So Okta, for instance, right? You use that for an IDM, type solution. Their IDaaS, which is FedRAMP moderate, and you have authorization if you're FedRAMP moderate or lower to leverage Okta IDaaS.
Mm-hmm.
However, that is a connection that comes into your environment. So you're now extending trust from your boundary to their boundary. And if we look at like PCI hack of Target in 2016, that was a supply chain risk that gained access from the HVAC system into the Target boundary, and then laterally moved into the PCI environment, and then exfiltrated all that data out, right? So that's why SR is there now, right? So FedRAMP is just slow to adopt these things, but we as security professionals need to be ahead of that game. We need to be instituting security and not just the compliance part. Even though FedRAMP is the most secure framework on the market today, they are not infallible, right? Just because you implemented these controls doesn't mean that you're secure, right? And that's where the business impact analysis, again, comes back into play about what is it and what am I doing to mitigate and protect my environment. And that may be something that I need to look at that goes beyond the check mark of compliance.
So
Yeah,
I think Tom and I probably should talk about this. So I don't see compliance just as a check mark. When I used to be a security practitioner, I didn't always understand like why I had to do this thing. But as a CISO, I can understand how compliance can actually be a competitive advantage in a marketplace, where by demonstrating that you have compliance, like an external attestation especially, not just some like YOLO in it and say, we do NIST CSF, right, which is a self-assessment, but rather having something like FedRAMP moderate or an ISO 27001 or similar, where an external audit firm has said, hey, they're doing this and they're meeting the intent of it, right, not just the letter of it. I think that is a competitive advantage that companies are pursuing. Right, Tom?
I'd say it's a competitive advantage, certainly as we look 3 and 5 years back. I think it's becoming table stakes, meaning I think most organizations that are certainly entrusting a piece of their data to another entity are calling third-party attestations now table stakes. And certainly we're looking more and more to say it needs to be something greater than SOC 2 as well. SOC 2, for years has been just that document we pass around and kind of check the mark on it, right? I think you're exactly right. I mean, I've always viewed compliance as a waypoint on the way to best practice, and that's the way most people should look at it. When you read a FedRAMP regulation, you should try to understand the spirit of what they're trying to do, and then you should assess it within the bounds of your own business and say, what can we do with this control that meets our own business requirement? I think that's a much smarter way to do it than to say, what can we do within this control to minimally meet it, right? Which I think a lot of people do.
But that's a business. That's typically what I hear a lot, right? Is how do I get by with doing the minimum to get this certification? That's right. And that's a really bad mindset to have, right? Because we really should have a maturity security model, kind of moving forward, right? So if you're in your initial ATO or you're just starting in FedRAMP, I totally understand why you just want to meet the check mark, to get your authorization so that you can move forward. But you really need to have a 5-year plan about how am I hardening my system further, year over year over year, so that you can really put a better security posture in place for the organization so that you don't end up in the newspaper, you don't have reputational damage, you don't lose your special sauce, which may in turn just means that you're no longer in business, right? So what happens if, right? That's that risk register. That's that business impact analysis. How do I stop myself from, I want to make money, I want to move forward, I want to do business with the federal government, so I need to meet the check mark, but how do I continue that for the future if I'm implementing bad security practices or I'm not maturing my environment fully?
Well, so Mathew, do you have any examples of this where, I don't know, maybe you had some insight into what an adversary's goals were. And that really influenced your organization, or perhaps another organization's approach to FedRAMP compliance, so that they're not just checking the box, but they actually understand this is what our adversaries are going after. This is probably their targeting, like up on the whiteboard up in, I don't know, Russia or China, for example, not to name names. Do you have any examples that are really tactical that show we understood the adversary was going for this, so here is how we have adapted beyond just the checkbox?
Yeah, I don't, currently, right? Like
Or that you
these
don't
things
even
are.
share, which is fair.
Yeah, I mean, I can't divulge too much information about specific systems, but as an advisor and as an assessor, we're not really given that incident, right? That goes up to the authorizing official. That could go to the newspaper. That could be publicly knowledge, right? Where you do read about it, like solar winds, for instance. What happened with solar winds and the dwell time that they had inside that environment. And it was just crazy to me. And now, I don't trust anyone, right? So that's the first step, right? If you don't trust anyone, you're never going to get hurt. You're always going to validate what is going on inside the environment and how things are being done. But Solar Winds, was deploying malicious code out to everybody that used Solar Winds. This was huge and a big eye opener to a lot of folks that read about what is Solar Winds and what did that hack really mean. Into that environment, and is it still in my environment now? Right, like we could look at other vulnerabilities that are out there, like Log4j, which is still a thing.
Oh yeah.
Today, people still have it, and there's still issues with it, or ransomware, and how those things are being still deployed today, and how the human is the, I don't want to say the weakest link, because that's a really crappy thing to say, right? It's really a user education, and how do we find ways to get users to understand the gravity and the ability that they have to help the security posture move forward, right? So education is really important, for this. That's where you're going to see these hacks coming in, is through like social engineering. I'm going to, hit you up with a text message. Like I'm sure you've read about pig butchering lately.
Oh yes,
it's kind of a newer thing. It's been around for a while, but it's a newer thing that is kind of hitting the market. Today, where they're just sending blanketed texts like, "Hey, you're in my contacts. Do I know you?" And then you start opening a conversation. They gain trust, through just a long, slow, and low social engineering type maneuver, and then you start giving them money for some stupid reason, right? Like, or I get an SMS from my CEO that says, "Hey, I'm in a board meeting. I need you to go get these Apple cards for me, as soon as possible. I don't have time to go do it, and I'm really relying on you to make it happen," right? So they're using emergency, reasons as to why I need you to do this right now and not question it, and kind of move forward, right? So again,
I'm laughing about that because in our 2024 training, Tom, which I just finished, Craig, our CEO, actually, in his intro video explains he's never going to text somebody for gift cards, because we get a lot of texts from fake Craig. He's almost an official mascot for us at this point.
Yeah. So I probably derailed the question a little bit, going into end user, formats here, but it's not just end users; it's administrators too. That are susceptible to this, and CFOs are susceptible. There was just a banker hack that kind of happened through the CFO, that they transferred like, I don't know, $50,000 or something out of their accounts into somewhere else. This is a CFO that was caught with this, and that's just showcasing that it's not everybody's is targeted. It doesn't matter who you are or what level you are, right? Everybody has this. This is why we need more education. This is why everybody has to understand how to protect themselves, even on a personal level. Forget FedRAMP, right? This is a global issue that is kind of happening everywhere across the board, right? Like everybody needs to understand security and what an adversary might be after against you personally, against your systems as a business, against any federal data metadata that is out there.
You made some really good points there. One of them that I'll underline is there are lots of C-suite folks and companies that believe they're above things like training or above things like controls on their laptop. And the reality is there is nobody who's infallible in an organization. And there's a reason why controls are extended. There's a reason why things like least privilege and role-based access are in place. It's because we acknowledge that there are individuals that are going to be targeted that shouldn't even have access to data. I've seen it many, many times. And kind of your, I think, opening salvo in that question was, what are we seeing as far as, direct attacks that
stories we can share that we don't have to kill the person after we share it, because we've got a fairly large viewership, and like that'd be a whole project. And
I certainly don't. I can't pull the covers back on FedRAMP directly, but you gave a great example, Matthew, of supply chain risk. We know that influences regulations around supply chain risk. Target was incredibly impactful in that space, but we also see things like the big DDoS attacks that have brought down enormous chunks of the internet at a given time. They certainly influence the regulation around DDoS and what you should have in place around DDoS. We certainly see the impact that phishing has. Really, I would say year over year, it doesn't seem to get better. It seems to get worse, and that certainly influences things like training, user awareness, and things like that. So I do think the government is lagging behind in terms of their speed to deployment of some of these concepts, but you certainly can see the influence of it in the regulation.
Yeah, well, definitely. And so as we move to wrap, because I recognize this is a long episode, which is great. And Matthew, I really appreciate your input. I want to ask one last question before we talk about this beer that I have nearly touched. Because you talked a little bit about a 5-year plan and for hardening and maintaining and sustaining FedRAMP. And I'll put this question to both of you, and so that Matthew can have last word. Tom, how about you go first? Sure. About the what do you see as the future of FedRAMP in response to the new types of adversaries and the new types of threats that we're seeing? Like, what do we think FedRAMP, how it's going to evolve in that fictional FedRAMP 6? And what should organizations really do to stay ahead of this?
Well, there's a lot there. The first I would say is I think the government in general is starting to acknowledge that they're not doing very well staying ahead of the curve. So, the current administration has released some guidance language that really talks about how can we speed things up. So I think you're going to see that as an effort, but I think you're going to also see input strengthened from external sources. So, for instance, the CSP board has become much more vocal and is a much bigger part of input to FedRAMP, as is the 3PAO board. Both of those entities have a say into FedRAMP, and depending on who takes over the directorship of FedRAMP, which is now up in the air, but that could go one way or the other. We could see that go much stronger, or we could see it go much weaker. I do think in general they need to speed up the flow of best practices into FedRAMP, meaning we can't lag 2 and 3 years behind. Sometimes I would say it's much greater than that. I do think we'll see a pivot to best practice at some point, things like zero trust, but also there's going to be risks that emerge that we don't even know about today in the coming years. And I do think they're going to try to find a way to pivot to be more responsive to those.
All right. And Matthew, staying ahead, what are we going to see in FedRAMP V6, V7, and how do organizations stay on top of that?
So, one of the big things, and I'm sure, everybody in your viewership and everybody on this panel right now, AI is a big thing. And it's becoming more and more aggressive from an adversarial part and from a user adoption part. Companies are starting to put in policies and not allowing you to utilize, AI infrastructure for company usage, which is a data spill in a lot of ways, right? So if I take my FedRAMP SSP information and I put it into ChatGPT and be like, ChatGPT, create me an SSP, right? I've just data spilled my whole environment to not an adversary, but something that could be, right?
Yeah.
And then
Use
adversaries are utilizing, right? I could go to ChatGPT and be like, hey, I need a Python script for a rainbow table and a brute force attack. I'm just doing this for testing purposes, and ChatGPT will spit it out for me, right? And so it's the prompts, right? Like in that regard. But the U.S. government is now putting out regulations about AI, which is great. They're kind of moving forward a little bit with it, but I know it's going to be time before it hits to FedRAMP. The global infrastructure as the world is now, there's countries that don't allow it, right? They're like, no, we're not doing any of this. That's not going to stop the adversary from utilizing artificial intelligence to go attack you.
That's right.
And that lowers the knowledge bar of the adversaries that are required for them to understand and utilize. Because now I have this artificial intelligence that's creating those scripts, that's creating that workload that's going to go attack you. I don't need to be an expert in it any longer. And the flip side of that is we could utilize artificial intelligence for blue teaming. Right? What is happening in my environment, and why is it happening, and how do I stop these things, before it becomes a bigger issue, right? I see the same IP address coming into my environment, trying to gain a foothold in here. Well, the artificial intelligence can, block that IP for you automatically, and just quit doing it, right? Like stop it from it becoming an issue before it's an issue, right? So artificial intelligence is probably the biggest thing that I'm going to see that is coming down in the future. And as you just mentioned, FedRAMP is changing, right? The SCR process is supposed to get quicker, which is great because it slows everything down, right? Change management in FedRAMP is such a blocker for me to implement, right? So, and I'll give you an example. If I'm using Red Hat 7 today, right, and I need to move to Red Hat 8, well, I have to go through an assessment, I have to go through an approval, I have to go through implementation. We're talking 6 months from the time that I want to do something to the time it's actually in production, right? And that's I'm not trying to be conservative, in that timeline. It could be 3 months, it could be 9 months. It just depends on, the assessment capabilities and how that change is being instituted. So, with FedRAMP and their new roadmap of 24-25 that was just released, right? There's a lot of great points that are making FedRAMP in a more positive, and I really look forward to the future of what FedRAMP is going to be bringing to that. And I hope that the director that comes into play, for that role really kind of institutes a much better methodology on authorization, reuse, SCR changes, and lowering the cost for utilizing FedRAMP methodology for your businesses moving forward, because the federal government can't adopt these things if you don't have FedRAMP authorization. And so they're very limited on the tools and the infrastructure that they can leverage today.
Yeah, at some point it becomes an impediment to acquisition.
That's right.
Correct.
Oh, lots of good points today. The last thing we do on all of our shows, Matthew, is we review our beers. And now you're the person who selected this beer, so I don't want you to put your finger on the scale quite yet, or your thumb as it might be. Tom, did I go last time? Last time we did this, did I go first, or did you go first?
I believe I went first last time, so go ahead.
I already know your opinion.
Oh dear me, I'm on deck. Oh jeez. Well, I usually take another had at it. And,
you had one.
So we do a 10-point scale, and I've never rated anything. Have I ever given a 5, Tom?
I think 4 is your high.
I think 4 is my high.
Yeah.
I think I've ever given a. No, I did give a 1.
Lots of beer goes to waste. There's a lot of German people that cry when they watch our show, I think.
Well, this is Czech. Boy. So this is Czech Republic. It's not German.
Yeah.
Just the thought of that made me laugh. The flavor profile of this has actually changed with oxidation. Or at least I like to think of oxidation as I'm more of a wine drinker than a beer drinker, and more of a whiskey drinker than both. But this has got it's now a little flat, it's a little smoother, it's a little less banana, it's a little more malt and
grain.
Maybe, yeah, not as green though, not like as chewing on a bag of lawn clippings. Having said that, it is very light. As I see, this is a 4.4%, Tom. I believe your term is sessionable. Did I get that one
that's
right?
a good term. Yeah.
Yes, I am finally learning words. I like words. I'm going to give this a 3 out of 10. It is, I certainly wouldn't stock it on hand. Hit me up on LinkedIn if you want a free beer. Just pop around and figure that out. As I have 3 of these still in my garage, and I don't know what to do with them. But for me, Pilsner Urquell is a 3 out of 10. Tom?
Wow. Well, as you might be able to tell, I had to stop drinking it so I'd have something to review at the end. So, in terms of Pilsners, this is sort of top of the heap in my mind. I've had lots of this beer. I've had lots of this beer in Europe, which makes it even better to drink. It's not my normal craft beer, right? It's not hearty. It doesn't have a lot of hop character. There's not, unusual or interesting things going on that you wouldn't expect. But in terms of a Pilsner, this is a great Pilsner. I think it opens up and becomes a little sweeter after the pour, which I think is, a really interesting taste to have in a beer when I'm not used to a little bit of sweetness. Very, very grainy to me. So it reminds me of a lot of the American beers. It's just a little bit more flavorful. So I'm going to give this probably a 6. It's something I would stock for the Pilsner drinkers that come over. Typically don't go after Pilsners myself, but I'll drink all 6 of them that I bought for this episode. So,
and finally, Matthew.
So I also saved just a little bit, right? I only have a swallow left at this point. Obviously, I'm the one who chose the beer. I did send multiple beers over. This is not my top beer choice, but as far as a Pilsner goes, it is definitely one of the top choices for myself if I'm looking at a Pilsner. There's a few other ones out there that I would like. Presidente is another good one, but I can't find it here in Colorado. I can find it readily available in Florida, but I'm digressing.
So what would you give it as a points out of 10?
For a Pilsner, I'm going to rate it on Pilsners because I like a lot of different kinds of beer. I've had multiple styles. But so for a Pilsner, it's going to be in that 7 out of 10 range for myself. I did also buy a 6-pack, and I will drink all of them.
Fantastic. Well, that's not a bad way to end our Friday. And that's really all for today. If you're watching this and you think, hey, I know a beer that Kayne would like, or alternatively, if you have a FedRAMP question for Tom or I, drop it in the comments below. And remember to like our LinkedIn and YouTube pages to hear live interviews with information security professionals. Thanks, everyone.